In this video, we're going to look at a library called Django-Sesame, which provides authentication links that allow users to log in and access views in your application without having to fill in a login form. Now, I've got the GitHub repository opened here, and as you can see, it provides magic links, URLs with authentication tokens for one-click login. And if we scroll down to the description here, we can see an example of a URL that might be generated by Django-Sesame. You have an endpoint here, it's example.com, and after that you have a query parameter which has this token here. Now, Django-Sesame allows you to have these tokens in your URLs, and you can send links to users that will allow them to log in with their user based on the URL. And you can also get a bit more granular with the library. You can expose only a certain number of endpoints or URLs so that these links here don't work throughout your entire application, but only with specific URLs. And this can be useful if you want to expose a report to management or something like that, where they don't necessarily have an account in your application, but you want them to be able to access a particular report without making it publicly available. Now, we're going to dive in this video and we're going to see how to work with Django-Sesame. Now, some use cases are outlined below here in this documentation. Logging in by email, and that's something that is employed a lot by Slack. You have the authenticated links example where you generate something and then you expose it to users, and that can allow them to access a specific view. And the last example here as well, non-critical private websites. So on some websites, you might not want users to have to think about passwords and stuff like that. So you can use this technique with Django-Sesame in order to create authentication on those sites. So that's enough talking about this library. Let's actually see how it works. There's starter code on GitHub here, and I'm going to link this below the video. You can grab this code and we're going to work from this starter code here. And I've got that open right now in Visual Studio Code. And this is a very simple Django app. It's got one URL and one view. And there's a couple of templates here as well. We have a base template and an index.html that extends the base template. Now, what we're first going to do is create a Python virtual environment, and we're going to install Django and Django-Sesame into that environment. So open up a terminal after you've cloned this project, and you can use the python-m-venv module, and you can give the environment a name as well. So I'm going to call it venv-sesame. Now, that will create a directory in this project that contains the files you need to activate and install libraries in that environment. Now, I'm in Windows at the moment. You can activate a virtual environment by going to the environment and the scripts folder and then calling the activate script. Now, on Mac and Linux, it's very similar. You go to the bin directory and the activate script, and you use the source command to do that. And once you've activated that virtual environment, we're going to use the pip install-u pip command, and that will upgrade pip to the latest version. And that's kind of a best practice when you activate a new environment. So once you've done that, we're going to install Django in that environment. And we also want to install Django-Sesame. So let's cross over to the documentation, and you can see that you can install this with pip. So we're just going to copy the name of the library down into the terminal here, and we'll paste that. Once we run that, it will install those in our new virtual environment, and then we'll be able to use them in this project. So that's installed now. Let's go back to the Sesame documentation. There's another step in this getting started section. You need to add the Sesame model backend to your authentication backends setting. This is a setting in your settings.py file, so we're just going to copy this. By default, that's set to the Django auth model backend. We're extending that to include the Sesame model backend. So let's copy that. We'll go to the settings.py file, scroll to the bottom, and we can paste and overwrite the default authentication backend. And this Sesame model backend is what's going to look for that token, and it's going to handle the authentication based on these magic links. Now that the setup is done, we're going to follow the quick example on the Sesame documentation. Now, we have the quick example just below the getting started section. I'll link this page in the description. What we're going to do is import from sesame.views this login view, and we're going to create a URL that allows us to log in with these tokens. So let's copy this import from sesame.views import login view, and we'll paste that into the urls.py file within the core application. So we paste that at the top. We now have a login view available to us, and now we're going to copy this URL here that's defined in the documentation, and we'll paste that into our URL patterns setting. So this uses the login view and it turns it into a functional view with this asView function. What we're going to see now is how to operate with this URL and how to generate tokens using Django-Sesame, and how this URL can then authenticate and validate those tokens. Now, we're going to need a user for this quick example to work, but before we do that, I've forgotten to install Django extensions in this project. We're going to use use that to load up the shell in a second, so install that. And then once you've done that, what we're going to do is run the default Django migrations with the python manage.py migrate command. That'll generate a database file, and then we can run the create super user management command. So we'll create a user called admin with an email address of admin@test.com, and we'll just give them a simple password of test here. So that creates a super user in our application. Let's clear the terminal, and what we want to do is use Django-Sesame to create a login URL for that user, specifically for that user. In other words, we're going to generate a token that's bound to that user but cannot be used by any other users in our application. Now we're going to make use of a function from Django-Sesame, so I'm going to go to the API reference. This is one of the token generation functions it provides. It's called getQueryString. That's a function that takes in a user in your application and optionally a scope, which we'll see in the next video, and it generates a complete query string that will authenticate that user that's passed in. So when you have a normal URL in Django, as it says here, you can use that function to add a query string containing the token. Now we're going to see this quickly in the Django shell, and then we're going to move on and do this in a Django view. So let's load up the shell plus command, and we're going to import that function from sesame.utils import getQueryString. Now what we're going to do is we're going to grab our user from the database with the user.objects.first function, and make sure that's objects, not object. And then what we're going to do is go back to the documentation here, and below the getting started we have this quick example. So we fetch the user from the database, and then we use this function here to generate a token. So let's create this login URL within the terminal. We'll paste that below, and I'm going to get rid of the S here. We don't want to use HTTPS. So once we've defined that login URL, what we do is we can add to it the result of calling getQueryString with the user passed in. That will give us back something like this that we can then append to the base URL. So let's copy this here, and we're going to paste that into our terminal, and that should give us back a URL. And what we're going to do is copy that URL and visit that page, and hopefully we'll see that that is actually logged us in. So if we go back to the browser, I'm going to paste that URL in, and we should see it hopefully working. Before we do that, don't forget to exit the shell and actually start the Django development server, and then we can actually access the URL. So let's go back to the browser. Now when I paste that URL in, it's trying to redirect to the account's profile page. That's the default login URL for Django, which means that this login has actually been successful. And we can also go to the admin page. Remember, this is a super user. Now we've not logged in to the admin form, but we have access to the basic admin page, and that means that the login URL we had with that token has actually worked. Now what we're going to do is we're going to amend a few things. If we look at the URL we had before, you can see that the key for the query parameter is Sesame. We can actually change that with a setting. So within our settings.py file at the bottom, I'm going to paste in one of the settings from Django-Sesame, and that's the token name, and we're going to set that to super secret for this video. Let's now do something useful with this application. Now hopefully you can see the power of these links. They can log you into the application without having to fill out forms, and this is used by Slack, and it's used in various places on the web to expose authentication based on URLs, or expose particular URLs and views based on a token in the URL. So let's now see how we can actually apply this to a URL and view in our own application. So what we're going to do is go back to the views.py file, and we're going to create a new view here. So first at the top, I'm going to import the login required decorator, and then I'm going to paste a very simple view into this file here. It's called secret view, and it's protected with the login required decorator. Let's also add a URL that points to that view, so we'll do that below the Sesame login. And finally, we're going to create this secret.html template within the templates directory, so secret.html, and I'm going to paste this code in here. So again, it extends the base template, and it has these secret messages in the template. And what we're also going to do in the index.html file, we're going to add a link to this new template, so an anchor tag that has an href pointing to that secret URL. So let's run the Django server here, and we're going to go back to the application. We're going to log out of this application. Now we go back to the template page. Now we have this link to the secret page, and if we click that link, we have the page not found, and that's because we're not logged in. And this detects that we're not logged in, and it's trying to redirect us to a login form. Now what we'd like to do in the context of Django-Sesame is provide a URL that allows users to log in, and therefore access views that are protected with the login required decorator. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Django-Sesame to generate a login URL, and then we're going to email that to a user. Now I'm not going to go through the process of setting up a proper proper email server here. So what we're going to do is go to settings.py, and we're going to add a couple of settings at the bottom. Firstly, I'm going to use the email backend setting, and we're going to set that backend to the console email backend. And what that does is simply output emails to the console, the terminal running the server. In a real application, you would of course use something like SendGrid or Amazon's SES. But for now, we're just going to use the console to keep things simple. And we're also going to add another setting here, and that's the login redirect URL. That's the URL that we go to after authentication. So we can save the settings file, and now we're going to create a simple form. And this form allows us to actually enter an email address, our own email address, and it will then email us a link to log into the application. So let's go to forms.py, and we're going to reference the Django-Sesame documentation for creating a login form. I'm just going to copy this class here, and we're going to paste that into the forms.py file. It's got one field, and that's an email field. And then if we go back to the documentation, we're going to copy this code within the body of the HTML file, and we're going to paste that into our own index.html file. So let's go to index.html, and we'll replace this hello at the top with the new code that we've got from Sesame. So this is basically a form element. It has a submit button, and it just renders the form as is. And let's add a couple of new lines, breakpoints below that. And the next step is to add this form that we're referencing to the context. So let's go back to views.py, and let's import some things at the top here. So we're going to import the user model, and we're also going to import the reverse function from Django's URLs module. We're going to import Sesame utils, and that's so we can use this function here, the get query string function, to actually generate the query string that contains the token. And finally, we're importing the email login form that we created here in the forms.py file. Now to begin with, I'm going to add the form to our context. So we'll add a key with form, and we'll instantiate this login form. So let's now go back to our page, and we can see how that looks. So we now have this single field, it's the email field, and a button to send the login link to that email address. Now at the moment this won't work because we haven't wired up this view here to handle a post request. So let's write the code now for that. So we're going to say if the request method is post, we're going to follow the standard procedure. We'll instantiate the form with the post data, and then we'll check if the form is valid. Now if the form is valid, what we want to do, I'll paste a comment in here, we want to email the user with the magic link. In other words, if the user has filled a valid email address in, we want to then email them a link to log in. But first of all, we need to check that an actual user exists with that email. So firstly, let's get the email from the form.cleaned data dictionary. And the name of the field is email. That will give us what the user has entered on the front end in a variable called email, and we can then use that email to check whether or not a user exists. So user.objects.filter, let's check if an email exists with that value, and let's grab the first record in the database. Now if a user exists with that email, that will give us the model object, otherwise the value of user will be none. Now we're going to check if the user is none. In other words, if there's no email address in the database that matches what the user's put on the front end. And what I'm going to do for now is simply paste some code in here, and we're going to go over this code. So we're adding an error to the form with the form.addError function. We specify the field we're adding the error to, it's the email field in the form, and we're just going to use a message of not found. Now as I've said above, don't do this in a real application, because if you do this, you're adding an error based on whether or not an email exists in your database. It exposes whether or not an email would exist in the database. This is a bit of a security issue, so don't do it in a real application, but we're just going to do it now so that we can determine whether or not an email exists in the database. So if there's no user, we add the error and we return the same template with this form. The form now contains an error which will be rendered. Now the other example is when a user does exist. Now we can log them in with Django-Sesame. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a link here, and we're going to use the request object that's passed into the function, and that has a function on it called build absolute URI, and to that we're going to reverse the Sesame login URL. And that refers to this URL here in our urls.py file. We're generating a link to this view that's going to log in the user when they get the email. So we reference the name of the view in that function here, in the reverse function, and then we pass the return value to this build absolute URI, and that will add the correct domain name and so on. I'll just print that link out to the terminal so that we can see it when we invoke this view. Now we have a user object that we've got on line 16. We can now call the get query string from Django-Sesame that we've seen in the terminal earlier. So to the link that we got above, let's append the sesame.utils.getQueryString query string function, and we'll pass the user into that function. That will give us a user-specific authentication link. And once we've done that, we can email the user the link. So I'm going to paste some code in here. Now, user objects in Django, they have an email user function. We pass to it a subject for the email and then a message, which we're using an F string here. We embed the user's username, and we also, importantly, we put the link into that email. The link is what we've built up above, and it contains our query string with the token. And that's all for this function. We'll just let that process and go back to the normal GET request if that succeeds. What we're going to do now is fill in the email address, and hopefully we'll see on this terminal here, the email pops up with a link that we can then use to actually log our user in without filling in any authentication forms. So let's go back to the page and refresh what we see here. Now, this will not work if we use a random email address, because it's going to say not found, and that's because when we looked at this view, we're trying to fetch a user by the email address that's passed into that form. But if there's no user with that email address, this block of code here will execute. It will add that not found message to the email field and re-render the template. Now, what we want to do is add the user that we actually have in the database. So let's go back to the form and clear that out. And the email address was admin@test.com. So let's fill that in and send the login link. That will re-render the page. And if we now look at the terminal, let's go back to the terminal here. We have this email being sent to the terminal, and that's because we're now using the console email backend, and we have a link here that we're going to access. So let's copy that link, and we'll go back to the browser and paste that in. So we pasted that link in here. When we actually execute that, we now are taken to this secret page. We've logged into this page. We can go back to the home page, and we can now navigate to the secrets page, and that's because we are logged in based on this link that was generated and emailed to us. So that's the power of Django-Sesame. If you want to log in users without having to get them filling in any forms and passwords, you can generate these convenient URLs and securely email them so they can log into your app and access restricted content. Now, remember that this may be a security issue. If there's any errors in your application logic, for example, if you fetch the wrong user here and then email somebody the link to that user's profile, it's going to log that person in as this particular user, and that could be a big problem in your app. So you need to make sure that you test this stuff thoroughly. Now, you can get more granular with this library. We can only expose single views or particular views. So what I'm going to do is we're going to add another URL into the urls.py file, and it's going to be to a URL called secret report, and we're going to create a view for that particular URL. So let's go to views.py, and I'm basically going to copy this URL here, and we're going to give it the new name of secret report view. And because it's a secret page, of course, we want to use the login required decorator. Now, this view renders a secret report template, so let's create that now. Secret report.html, and we'll paste some very simple code in here. Now, let's imagine that this single view here, we want to expose this to anyone who has a valid token in the URL, but we don't want to log them into the entire application. So for example, if a user has that URL, they can then access that particular view, but they can't just go and access the other views. So we're going to change some of the logic in this email submission form above. First of all, when we have a valid email address, what we're going to do is we're going to change this URL that we're generating. Now, currently this goes to Sesame's login URL. If we go to urls.py, you can see that we have a login view here. So that will log users into the entire application. This is just an alternative to filling in a normal login form that gives you access to all login required views. Now, instead of that, what we want to do is only expose this particular report URL here. So we're going to copy that, go back to views, and I'm going to change the view name to secret report. So when we reverse that, we'll get the URL for that view, and the users will be emailed a link to that particular view. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to the application. Make sure you log out with the Django admin before you do this. Go back to the home page, and when you click this link, we get 404 not found because we're no longer logged in. Now let's fill the form in with this admin email address that we have in the database. We'll send the login link, and if we go to the terminal, we get the login link. So we're going to use that, and we're going to see that this doesn't work at the moment. So let's copy that, and we'll paste that into the browser. If we execute that, it takes us to a 404 not found page. We're trying to go to the secret report, but we're not logged in. As you can see in the views.py file, at the bottom, this view is protected with a login required decorator. We're generating a URL with a token, but the problem is we're no longer going to this particular login view, which logged us into the application. Instead, we're trying to access this view here with a token, but this view doesn't know anything about the token. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a decorator from Django-Sesame, the Authenticate decorator, decorator that will allow access to this view when there's a valid token in the URL. So what we're going to do is go back to the Sesame documentation and the API reference here. So one of the sections is for token validation. There's different ways to do this. We've seen this login view that looks for a token in the URL, and it will then log a user in normally to your application if it finds a valid token. Below that we have another option, and that's a decorator, the Authenticate decorator. Now importantly, we can use this on specific views, so we only authenticate users with a valid token in particular URLs in our application, so we don't log them into the entire application. And you can see that below here. It says Authenticate doesn't log the user in permanently. It's intended to provide direct access to a resource without exposing all of the other private resources. And that's important if you want to expose one or two things in your application to users with a link, but you want to keep a number of the other pages private. And this is a little bit more secure than this login view. So let's see what we can do here. So we're using Authenticate above our views. It's a decorator. So what we're going to do is go to views.py, and at the top we're going to import that decorator from Sesame. So from sesame.decorators we import Authenticate, and below we're going to add this decorator to this view. So we add the Authenticate decorator, and once we've added that, we can then go back to our page. Let's go back here and fill in that admin email address, send the login link, and then we'll go back to the terminal and we can copy the link that's been sent and paste that into the browser. Now this time it should hopefully work because we've decorated with Authenticate. So we have a URL with this token, and it allows us access to any views that are decorated with this Authenticate decorator. So we're no longer logging users into the app. We're now just giving them access to any view with this Authenticate function. So we're not calling this URL with the login view anymore. We're now just using the decorator. And to prove that this is more secure and that this works only with specific URLs, if we try and access the secret view, which doesn't have the Authenticate decorator, it just has the login required decorator, then this is not going to work. It's going to try and redirect us to a login form. So if you get rid of report in this URL and replace that just with secret, then we try and log into that URL, we get a 404 not found. This only works with the secret report URL that has the Authenticate decorator. So that's how we can expose individual views to be accessible with a valid token, while at the same time protecting other URLs in our application from being exposed to those users that have the link. Now this will work if I add the Authenticate decorator to the secret view as well, because then that decorator will look for the token, it will validate the token, and if it is valid, it will give users access to that view. So let's go back and we'll try and access that secret page again. If we now execute this, we are actually going to get the page. We're not going to get a 404 and we're not going to get a redirect to a login form. We're going to get access to this page as well, because now we've protected that particular view with the same Authenticate decorator. So the important thing to know, this Authenticate decorator, it's applied at the view level, and it gives you more granular control over which endpoints you want to expose with your links and your Django-Sesame tokens. Unlike the login view that we've seen, this is not logging users into our app. So if we go to the admin interface, when we try and access that, we get a login form, and that's because Authenticate is not logging us in. Whereas beforehand, the login view from Django-Sesame's views module, that was logging us in when we accessed that view with a valid token. And you can read more about this in the documentation here. In the user guide, you have a section here for authenticating tokens. And there on the sidebar, you can read the distinction between the login view and belowhand the view decorator. I'll leave a link to this page in the description. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching. In this video, we've learned about the Django-Sesame token-based authentication and how you can authenticate users with a URL that contains a valid token that the library has generated. We've also learned how to use this login view. We create a URL pattern that references the Django-Sesame login view, and when we hit that view with the token, it will log users into the application. And on the other hand, for more granular access, we've also seen this view decorator, and this can be applied to specific views that we want to expose with a link in our application. So this is a little bit more secure than the login view. It depends on your use case. It might be perfectly valid for you to log users in with the login view. That can be very convenient, especially for users on mobile apps. Now in the next video, we're going to see some other features of Django-Sesame. We're going to look at scoped tokens, which give users access to specific resources, perhaps a detail view for a user profile. You can imagine a scenario where you want to share your user profile with other people. So we're going to see how to share those with particular IDs rather than exposing all user profiles. That's a use case for scoped tokens. We're going to see that in the next video. We're going to see authenticated links, where we can authenticate users even if they don't have an account doing in our applications. If we look at the way this is working at the moment, if we go to views.py, the logic we've got here requires that we have a user with the given email, but you might want to send links to people that don't have a user account. And this can be achieved with the authenticated links and scope tokens. We're going to see that in the next video. For now, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.